As long as there are people willing to abuse their power and their authority, there will be no shortage of work for Alex Gibney. In 2005, he turned his documentary lens on a story of spectacular corruption with Enron, the smartest guys in the room.
This is a case of America's largest corporate bankruptcy.
Alex showed how a handful of executives could bankrupt a company and still walk away with millions.
It just immediately had all the makings of a gigantic scandal.
Enron was nominated for an Oscar, but lost out to these little guys.
Because there are fewer males than females here, hostilities among the ladies are inevitable.
Penguins hate justice. Alex, by the way, would win his Oscar 2 years later with Taxi to the Dark Side, a powerful film that exposed the Bush administration's role in the torture of U.S. military detainees.
People were being told to rough up Iraqis that wouldn't cooperate. We were also told they're nothing but dogs. And you start doing things to them you would never dream of.
He then told the story of the rise and fall of this guy, New York Governor Eliot Spitzer, and explored the part Spitzer's powerful Wall Street enemies may have played and the sex scandal that brought about his downfall.
He knew that his entire political career was on the line, and ultimately, vice just took over virtue. He could not control himself.
Alex says his gifts as a filmmaker stem from childhood. His pops was a journalist, his mom a writer, his stepdad a political activist, and they all encouraged his curiosity. Now, Alex is telling a very different story from his previous films. The Last Gladiators focuses on former hockey enforcer Chris Knuckles Nyland and poses a question for all hockey tough guys. When your career is over, how do you stop being an enforcer and get back to normal life? Please welcome Alex Gibney. Nice to see you.
Hey, good to see you.
How are things?
Great.
Excellent.
Great.
You are a sports fan.
I am.
So one could not be surprised that you would tell a sports story again. However, why was Chris Nyland the aging enforcer that you focused on?
Well, you know, a group of people came to me to do a film about enforcers writ large, as part of that, we were looking for a main character, kind of hang it on. And Chris was so unvarnished, so for real, and so willing to talk about both the sport and also his challenges and his fights, not only during his playing time, but his fight against substance abuse afterwards, that it was just, you know, perfect. It was perfect casting.
And it's an interesting thing because it's really the only pro sport where there even exists a category like enforcer. And
right.
there's no out of bounds, right? You've got the boards. These guys, so you can't get away from anybody when you're playing hockey. So the idea of an enforcer is just complicated to begin with, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, you'd think it's simple. Oh, these guys just go out to fight, to amuse us. But in fact, the job of the enforcer is to prevent other teams from, they almost all say this, taking liberties with their star players. They're there to protect their star players and to give them the room that they need to maneuver on the ice.
Funding from NHL owners, that's really interesting in this, because the NHL doesn't come out looking like the villain, but they don't come out looking like they're clean in this either. And did that, when you're aware of where the money comes from, does that alter at all how you approach a film? Not really. I try pretty hard to put that out of my mind, and usually I structure my contracts in such a way so that there's no editorial interference from the money. Yeah. But it is interesting that a lot of the money for this film came from NHL owners. I think there is a kind of schism, you know, in the league about how they feel about fighting and about these enforcers. And I think, you know, a lot of these owners felt, you know, this is a moment to take a look at those guys, who they were and why they did what they did, because it was important. There are other people who want to just eliminate fighting. Yeah. And I think that struggle is going on because of the fan base. It's like some people go to the games, particularly live, yeah, to feel the fighting and to feel that heat. And because it's part of the ethic or code of the game, other people want it to eliminate it entirely. And I think the league doesn't know how to handle that schism. And so the fact that it was funded by NHL owners is interesting in that regard, because it means that you can see the division even among the ownership. Was it hard to get these guys to talk about, you're talking to, was it hard to get them to be vulnerable? The surprising thing about Chris, as tough as he was how vulnerable he was and how willing he was to talk about his failings and his weaknesses and his struggle. And interestingly enough, a number of the other enforcers were quite willing to talk about that too. You know, they were quite candid about fear. You'd think, well, these guys weren't afraid. They were terrified. You know, every day somebody like Bob Probert talked about how scared he was before every game. It's something that they live with, and I think
they're happy to have the opportunity to really reckon with it and be honest. Now, you know, they're not Oprah-like in the way they express themselves, but still, I think, given how tough they are, they're amazingly forthcoming about their emotions.
Well, how do you address it then? What sorts of conversations do you think we need to be had? Not just about hockey fighting, but just about the way we approach violence in our own lives.
Well, look, I think, too, you know, one thing we have to be terribly careful about, and even the enforcers would say this, is, you know, there's a difference between two people who are more or less equals reckoning with each other in a kind of a sanctioned way. It's another thing when you have people who are terribly more powerful beating on somebody who's relatively helpless. Yeah. It's that abuse of power. Frankly, it's that abuse of power that really burns up people like Chris. That's one of the reasons that he feels he's avenging that. If you're looking for a common thread in some of my films, I've always been interested in the abuse of power and very angry at people who do abuse it.
Yeah, you certainly see it, especially in the war films, right? You get a real sense of that. What did you learn about yourself through this process?
Well, one thing I learned about myself on this film was that I have a certain character trait in common with Chris, which is not necessarily one which guarantees your success, and that is that, you know, a lot of people, they say, who are successful suck up and kick down. I think I've had a tendency, as Chris has, to suck down and kick up, which is not always a great recipe for success.
That could be troubling, couldn't it?
Yes, it is.
Do you think some of this in you is because of your old man and what he did for a living? He was a journalist, right?
He was a journalist, and, you know, he was a truth seeker in that sense, and I think, you know, that's something, and I think he was always curious to the end of his days. You know, that's something I model myself on, too, the idea that as you get older, you don't turn off, you don't settle in your views, you try to keep expanding your horizons and to become increasingly curious. That's a tough thing to do because you tend to get set in your ways, but if you can apply that, if you can apply that discipline and exercise that muscle, I think it's a good thing.
Do you make these things to make change?
I make these things as kind of agents provocateurs, to provoke people to think about stuff that they may not have thought about in precisely this way. And if that provokes change, then yes, I'm for that. But I generally don't make films as kind of pamphlets, which say, okay, vote for so-and-so on election day. What was it my stepfather once said? He would always say, I'm pessimistic but hopeful, meaning he was realistic about stuff, so realistic that he wouldn't break himself into pieces every day, but always hopeful that things could change so that he never lost that sense of wanting a better world or a better life.
Yeah, otherwise the cloud would be just too deep, wouldn't it?
That's right. And you see that with doctors and nurses in hospitals. I mean, the kind of gallows humor that they have, you know, in an emergency room in order to be able to handle that, but still they spend every day of their lives trying to heal people.
Yeah, well, they believe in good, ultimately, right? Do you believe in villains?
I believe that in all of us, there's a little bit of good and a little bit of evil. And I think one of the most dangerous moments is when you believe that the end justifies the means. And I believe that that's where the dark side always creeps out. Because then you think, well, if I'm good, then how can I ever possibly do anything bad? And I'm always distrustful of people who think that they figured everything out, because it usually is the first step on the path to corruption.
Do you believe that Julian Assange is a hero?
I'm doing a film about Julian Assange now.
That's why I ask. You're doing a WikiLeaks film.
Right. And so I guess my response to that is, let's talk about that when the film comes out.
How far into that project are you?
We're deep. We're in the editing room now, but we're still doing a lot of shooting. It's a fascinating story for all sorts of reasons.
What's the focus? Because WikiLeaks seems like a big story.
It's a big story. I mean, look, the focus is to some extent, we look a great deal at Julian and how he did what he did, why he did what he did, but also we look at the opposing forces, particularly the U.S. government. And in that sense, I think it'll be a pretty interesting story.
So we've established that you do like to look at the abuse of power.
Right.
Have you found that in this film yet?
Yes, but in unexpected places. Well, in some expected places and some unexpected places. I'm being vague with you because, you know, I'm still making the film, and so I'm reluctant to talk too much about it. I'm going through that process where I'm trying to reckon with everything and be, you know, wildly open to all sorts of possibilities.
It's good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks a lot, man.
Real pleasure. Alex Gibney, the film's called The Last Gladiators. We'll be right back.